So, investing in deep tech hardware today. I'm going to share some of the things we learned doing about 250 hardware deals with a lot of robotics, a lot of med tech, and some lessons were a bit costly, let's say. So, the key we found is, first is deal flow. In our case, because we invest at the prototype stage, those companies are not very visible because they haven't been funded yet. For us, that's been quite a challenge to us get connected to those companies and us getting visible to them so that that connection can happen. Second is we identified a number of biases we had when making investments in deep tech, and I'm going to share that. And then I'm going to talk about the de-risking. So on the deal flow side, when you pre-seed investors like us, you almost by definition pre-trend. Like it's things you invest in before the media talks about it. Media talks about it, it's too late. So how do you do it? In our case, we over time managed to build pretty good flow of applicants that give us an idea of what are the emerging trends, what could be some potential futures, and also through the connection with a number of corporates, we get to understand what kind of needs they have, and that might also orientate our investment thesis. Now a few biases. I'm going to share four. One is the sci-fi bias, another one I call the ugly duckling. That's the makeup bias and the Darwin-Wallace paradox. I'm not sure it's properly named, but I'll try to explain what that means. The first bias is the sci-fi bias. Is the fact that we grew up with a lot of sci-fi around us, and as investors, we're generally quite enthusiastic when we see things we've seen before, and we're like, oh, finally, this is happening. The jetpacks, the flying cars, the humanoid robots. All this is very cool. Problem is that it doesn't always work. So there's one company we invested in like that, and we thought their technology was so impressive. They're basically using liquid polymer combined with an electric field at 20,000 volts to transform the liquid polymer into fibers and guide that onto a shape so that they could print fabric onto whatever shape they wanted, without any seam, any stitching, nothing. And that actually kind of worked, if you like Mad Max type of style. Problem is, after 3 years of R&D and development, they really couldn't find a market. And we found that when we get excited by the technology and we can't find an application, can't find a particular B2B application, it's a very risky proposition to invest in those companies. So maybe on the panel we'll hear some other experiences along those lines. Sometimes the companies actually survive and do okay. So that's another example got us really excited. Modular robots. And modular robotics is really complex field. And I don't want to talk too much about robotics because I know we have experts in the room, so I'm going to be just very cautious about that. But essentially, modular robots have seen advanced research at MIT and EPFL in Switzerland. And I met researchers in Switzerland, and they had kind of similar type of modules. And I was quite impressed with the research. And what's interesting about it is that you attach the modules, and then the robot can recognize its own shape and adapt its movement to the number of modules that are attached. So it's kind of interesting. And I talked with the researchers. I said, okay, you managed to do that. That's great. And what do you want to use it for? And they were like, well, we're thinking about maybe a snake robot for like search and rescue type of thing. Like, okay. What else? Well, modular furniture that can change their height, maybe for old people. Or like, okay. But how much is the module? They said, well, a two set is about $3,000. So one knee essentially is $3,000. So the table is going to be quite expensive. And this team managed to build this for about only $500, which is very impressive. But still, we're not sure what that would be useful. And we talked with them, and they were really excited to do something educative, but they were also trying to find practical applications beyond education. And they couldn't find anything. They tried to launch it. See, that's how it works. Very cute. They tried to launch it on Kickstarter, and they couldn't really find a market there. And eventually, struggling between whether it was a toy, whether it was an education product, whether it was a tool, couldn't figure out. They kept going. They got a little bit of funding with a Chinese team. In China, sometimes you can get funding a bit more easily, so they managed to keep going. And about a year plus after, catching up with them, asked them, so how's it going? Are you selling your your products, your $500 robots. They say, oh no, we're not selling those robots, but things are going well. So you're not selling the robots, $500, and it's going well. So yeah, now we're selling $50,000 packages to schools for education. So they totally switched, and they had like 30 staff, and they were selling to schools because the robotics teachers realized that with such robots, they could spend most of the time on teaching robotics rather than spending time on assembling robots, like you would do if you want to try different configurations with maybe Lego Mindstorms. So it was really time saving for them, and they loved it. So the schools had huge budget for this type of education. And now they're doing very well. So this guy's happy. But overall, after we learned our lesson, we focused mostly on boring robots. So the one on the left is a robot that does inventory automatically in supermarkets. This one sweeps the pavement. This one cleans windows. This one cleans the floor. And this one inspects the wheels and does all sorts of inspection autonomously. So they don't look humanoid. They're very boring. Nobody really looks at them when they do their job, but they're actually really good businesses. So what we learned is that what's spectacular is often quite orthogonal with what's a viable business. Second bias is the ugly duckling. This one is difficult for early stage investors like us, because that means that when we look at the first prototype they have, it might look very unattractive. And we have to be able to imagine the beautiful swan that will come in the future. So I mentioned this inventory robot, and that's what it looked like when we invested. This is what they applied to our program with. And they told us later, actually, that the reason they applied to our program in China that they didn't really know that much about, because nobody else would give them money. And we're like, how can they not? Like, you have really amazing technology. It seems to be mostly ready. You just need to put improve the prototype and improve the appearance of the prototype, and then you'll be good to go. They say, well, nobody wants to finance it. There was a team for Willow Garage, and Willow Garage got the reference in robotics. So they came to us, and this is what they had a few months later. And then another few months, and they raised the seed round. They found their first customers, and I think things went actually really well. So a nice box on video can actually make a huge difference sometimes if you have the technology that's working. That's another example. So I mentioned Neura earlier, the headphones company. This is what they applied with. You can see not great videographers. The technology was actually coming from hospitals. One of the founders is a medical doctor, is an ear surgeon actually. And that's technology that's used to test the hearing of newborns, because they can't tell you if they hear or not. So you use basically a little earplug that will send a signal and measure the response to, by looking at the difference, check which frequencies are properly heard. They wanted to shrink that technology that generally sits on the lab bench into a pair of headphones. And they managed to do it. And that's the first product. But what they really wanted to do was the second product they're launching this year, which is the smaller version. And that's the real product that's going to be probably a really good success in the market. The first one was already quite successful, but you have to be able to see beyond the prototype, the first and the second product. Third one, this is a company we invested in about 5 years ago. They wanted to do a cleaning robot with autonomous navigation. 5 years ago, autonomous navigation was actually, indoor navigation was actually quite impressive. Today, your Roomba does it for $300, but at the time that was something. And they retrofitted some machines and advanced their prototype. And eventually, this is what they have today. And this is the company. It's about 100 people, Canadian company. They raised Series B of over $20 million. And this is the robot in Changi Airport in Singapore. What I find remarkable about this video is that nobody cares about this robot. And that's a success. Third bias, what we call the makeup bias. That means that sometimes you make a too pretty prototype that makes people believe that you have much more than you actually have. For investors who are not familiar with all the manufacturing process, for instance, that can lead to underestimate the risk in the investment. So those are two pictures of the May 2016 prototype of Neural, January 2018 product. A year and a half between the two. This was probably still risky because it wasn't clear whether they knew how to make it. So they went through a program, so they learned quite a lot about the supply chain, but still they hadn't done it. Once this is launched and on market, then everybody can see sales figures, and then you can, crunch numbers. But just in between, this is where a lot of opportunities can be found. When a lot of the manufacturing problems have been solved, but they're still not exactly there. But they're much farther along than this. On the last one, this is kind of a new addition, Darwin-Wallace paradox. This is what was written the year where the papers from Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace were presented in the Linnean Society of London. This year has not been productive contributions of interest and value. That was the reception of his groundbreaking paper. And we found that sometimes recognizing the significance of new ideas is not very easy. And I remember experiencing that the first time I saw an iPad. I didn't imagine that this would totally change parenting. Those are some products from Hacks, companies that might or might not be game changers. So this is, you could say, a holographic display. It's a company called Looking Glass Factory based in Brooklyn. And it's combined with a Leap Motion controller. So basically, you can manipulate 3D objects in the air. And that's another one here. That's a product that helps with, it's like a compass for finding people, even at miles of distance and without mobile network. That looks kind of a simple thing. And that company went to launch on Indiegogo. They raised close to $2 million on Indiegogo. And that looks kind of a nifty gadget. So I bought actually, 3 of those for, I have 2 nephews, so they run around, and it's useful to attach one to them. But what's interesting is that this company actually has almost defined a new standard in terms of transmitting low power, low volume data. And after they launched their Indiegogo campaign, they got contacted to inquire about their technology and their patents, and they had an offer for $20 million to acquire the patents. And it looks like a gadget. So sometimes not very easy to evaluate from a distance what technology, how interesting it is. So I'm going to go quickly over the tech, trend, team, and timing, the risk associated with those, and the different milestones. So when you invest in deep tech, the question is, do you need to be a specialist in that particular field to do an investment? So at Hacks, we do have some chops in some sectors, but definitely we don't cover all the things that we invest in depth. When we started investing in robotics and medtech in particular, we're not so sure that we would be able to handle it. And for us, what was important is to see a proof point through a working prototype, and to be able to evaluate that working prototype. After that, we are quite confident we could get them through cycles of prototyping, manufacturing, help them with repositioning if need was. The question is also whether or not patents matter. In some cases it does, but generally the key when you're a young startup, you're not really in any shape to defend patents against a larger company that wants to go after you. And I think overall, the challenge for investment in deep tech is that a lot of VCs want to avoid the embarrassment of funding the next Theranos. Basically funding a company that pretends to have technology that they actually don't really have working. So this is part of our due diligence process. When applicable, check the substance of the key patent, check the prototype, does it deliver the core functionality, assess manufacturability. So that's something we do quite well because we've been in Shenzhen for about 6 years. We have a big team there. We have hundreds of companies go through our program. Validating the price point with customers, because if you build something that's way too expensive, like a $500 consumer robot, it's going to be probably difficult. But maybe it's because you haven't talked to the right customers. Maybe you should have talked not to end users, but to schools or to other people in the middle. Evaluate the price versus the bill of material and operation costs. That's something we do quite well. Then determine the next milestone for funding. What do you need to achieve? Is it something on the product side, something on the business side? What are the next stage investors will want to see? Clarify the insights or action for end users. What exactly do you offer to end users? Evaluate the software complexity. We try to do that. Is the team using the right tech? So sometimes they're looking at the right problem, but not with the right solution. That happens. What would Google do? That's another question. Generally, the big companies are not really on the collision trajectory with you, but it's sometimes good to ask whether they would be interested in potentially buying you down the road, because that's also a very positive outcome. And then the skills needed, you have everything in the team, particularly in robotics, where generally you have to cover a lot of different aspects from mechanical, electronics, software, firmware. The market risk, that's another difficult one at early stage, because you don't have a product, so you don't have sales. And how can you do that when, like pre-product? How can you identify false positives? People, if you ask people around and you say, oh, should this exist? Very few people are going to tell you no. Don't want to break your heart, so they're just going to tell you, please go ahead, build that thing, and we'll see. But they're not really ready to put money down. Then also evaluate what's the minimum feature set you actually need, what's the right price point, what's the right demand. So there are programs that help go through those early validation. For example, use the business model canvas, getting out of the building, like Steve Blank advocates, and agile kind of research on customer development. So programs like iCore, Entrepreneur First, and the Deep Tech Founders, maybe you heard of some of those, iCore in particular. Another risk is the risk early stage, actually, is a founder's risk. And we think this is actually the highest risk pre-product, teams falling apart for different reasons. Some of those problems can be avoided. Those are different problems we identified, simply like sometimes they don't get along, they can't communicate, they give up, they can't execute. The riskiest is probably those three. Not being able to execute, having this kind of artist problem means that they're not willing to adjust their vision to the realities of market demand. And the third one is the maker addiction, where in a like an endless quest for perfection, they keep prototyping, and never shipping anything. Other risk is whether or not the founding team is able to cover all the bases needed to build a viable business, not just inventing things, but actually turning that into a product, turning that into a company, and then scaling the company and managing the company. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The Venn diagram, you need to find a scientist who's also a good manager, can scale with the company, is actually quite tricky. So very often that means you need kind of well-rounded team for that. At SOSV across the fund, after the first check we do, before we do the second check, we have all the funding teams go through this evaluation method called the HBDI profile, and that helps them identify within their team their preference in decision making. So some people are very right-brained, so either very adventurous, experimental, or very emotions-based or very relation-based. Some are very left-brained, so very rational, very analytical, or very practical. So if you want to attach personas to that, that would be if you're familiar with Star Trek, which I guess some of you are. You have Kirk, the final frontier, with the vision. Spock is all the logic, all the Scotty is all the practical thing, and then Bones is about the communication. And what we found is for many of our teams that are very technical, they're very strong at the aspects of vision, on the analytical aspect, but not so strong at actually organization, management things, and communication. And that's actually really detrimental to a team, because that means that they won't ship, and they won't be able to explain what they're doing clearly and sell. Timing also matters, depending on the field you're looking at. So I put a little quantum thing on the right, because that's a really exciting technology, but the timeline for quantum technology seems to be much longer than many others. So how deep should you go into deep tech? How early compared to the market? Discussing with some investors in San Francisco, basically the kind of consensus was about that being about 18 months ahead is great. Being 3 years ahead is terrible, because that means that you'll need not only to raise a seed round, but since you still don't have a big market developing, you probably need a second seed, which is going to be difficult to get. And then if it still doesn't pick up, then maybe you need another bridge behind that. And then the chances of getting all those three is very low. Some companies managed to do it. So here's an example. Magic Leap was founded in 2011, raised over $2 billion, and shipped their first product in August 2018, about 7 years after. But yeah, not everyone's Magic Leap. That worked for them. We have one company that's quite interesting that started position around sleep tech, a company called Sana Health. And their value proposition was to have a mask that can basically put you to sleep in 10 minutes. And that sounded like preposterous, but the research behind it was around pain management rather than sleep. The founder actually was in a very terrible accident and ended up in a wheelchair, and the doctors told him that he probably had only 5 years life expectancy because he wouldn't be able to sleep because of chronic pain. So he decided to research sleep really, really hard. 20 years on, he's still around, and he managed to prototype something that helped him survive all those years. And then a few years ago, some of the key components became affordable enough to put in a consumer product. So that's what he decided to do. The challenge was that you could say the sleep sector was like the well was poisoned with all the terrible sleep tech companies that were making all sorts of claims. And it took him a while to actually reposition the product towards something else. So it was hype, but it was crowded, it was really difficult. And today, they reposition entirely, they don't talk about sleep anymore, and they talk about solving pain without pills. That works much better. They're going the FDA route. There's things that were not a thing are now existing, like neurotech, neuromodulation are things that are more recognized. And it also matches really well with this the war against the opioid epidemic. So those are some recent news about the company, and now it's in really good shape, but it took a while to reposition the company. Another aspect toward reaching next milestone is where can you find resources for that? And sometimes they're not all in one place. So in Boston, you have a great ecosystem, but you probably don't have everything you need. You have a lot of funding, you have a lot of R&D talent, but how about prototyping resources that can also feed into production? If you prototype too far away from production, then when you need to bridge that gap, that can be really painful. That's why we encourage teams to do prototyping as early as possible in Shenzhen. And that's for hardware companies. And then sometimes your customers are not around, and the growth funding is not necessarily